History often teaches us to look for greatness in empires, in vast territories, endless armies, and famous capitals. But every so often, history flips the script. Sometimes, the fate of continents is decided not in imperial halls, but in frozen valleys, by people the world barely noticed. This is one of those stories, a moment when a small, overlooked land stood in the path of history's most feared war machine and refused to step aside. Now let me take you back to a bitter winter morning in January 1475. At first glance, nothing about that dawn suggested it would echo through centuries. Yet in the fog-drenched lowlands near Vaslui, a principality so small that many Europeans couldn't have found it on a map delivered a shock that rattled the greatest empire of its age. That morning, Moldavia, outnumbered, isolated, and fighting for sheer survival, didn't merely delay an Ottoman advance. It smashed an army so vast that contemporary chroniclers claimed it numbered as many as 137,000 men. What followed became one of those rare moments when a single battle slows an empire's momentum and forces the world to reconsider what a minor nation is capable of when its existence hangs in the balance. So why was Vaslui far more significant than it appears at first glance? Why did this single clash ripple across empires for decades afterward? And how did a small frontier state manage to break the most feared military force of the medieval world? To understand that, we need to step back and look at where Moldavia stood in the 15th century. Picture Eastern Europe in the 1400s. Moldavia lay wedged tightly between the Carpathian Mountains and the Dniester River. Not a grand kingdom like Hungary, not a sprawling power like Poland, but something far more dangerous, a strategic choke point. It was a narrow corridor, a bridge of land. Whoever controlled it could decide who entered the heart of Central Europe and who didn't. After the fall of Constantinople in 1453, that corridor became priceless. The Ottoman Empire, under Sultan Mehmed II, the same ruler who had shattered the greatest Christian city of the East, was surging northward and westward with terrifying speed. Year after year, borders collapsed. Cities fell. Entire regions vanished into Ottoman control. And suddenly, Moldavia found itself pressed between a rising superpower and the uneasy Christian kingdoms beyond it. To survive, Moldavian rulers played a dangerous diplomatic game. Tribute was paid when necessary. Alliances shifted when convenient. Anything, absolutely anything, to keep independence alive just a little longer. Then, in 1457, everything changed. A new ruler took the throne, Stephen III, remembered today as Stephen the Great. He inherited a land strained by tribute demands, constant threats, and pressure from every direction. But Stephen wasn't interested in slow suffocation. By this point, Mehmed II was no longer thinking in terms of border raids. His ambitions reached far deeper, toward Hungary, toward the very core of Christian Europe. But before an army could march that far, the unstable frontier had to be secured. That frontier was Moldavia. Since 1456, Moldavia had been paying annual tribute to the Ottomans, the price of survival, some would say. Stephen disagreed, and in 1464, he made a decision that looked almost suicidal on paper. He stopped paying tribute and marched to reclaim Chilia, a fiercely contested Danube port. Chilia was no minor prize. It controlled trade routes and river access, the economic bloodstream of the region. In modern terms, it was as if a small state had just seized a critical naval hub from a global superpower. The message was unmistakable. Stephen wasn't just defying the Ottomans. He was announcing that Moldavia was done being treated as expendable. That message echoed far beyond Istanbul, reaching Hungary, Poland, and every Christian court watching this small principality suddenly stand upright. Stephen leaned into that image. Moldavia was no longer merely a buffer state. It was the gate of Christendom, the last open door between Ottoman armies and the Christian world beyond. From that point forward, every Moldavian battle carried symbolic weight. Every soldier wasn't just defending Sisiava, their capital, they were defending the idea of Christian Europe itself. Geography reinforced that role. To the east, the Dniester River formed a cold, wide barrier, a natural shield marking the line the Ottomans longed to cross. But here's what's often overlooked. Stephen wasn't relying on courage alone. If he was going to confront an empire that could summon armies in the hundreds of thousands, he needed structure, discipline, and preparation. So he rebuilt Moldavia's military system from the ground up. First, he strengthened central authority, pulling power away from noble families who had long acted like independent rulers. Then came a bold, forward-thinking reform, freeing peasants from their ties to the land. Once freed, these men could serve as soldiers. Overnight, Moldavia's pool of fighting men expanded dramatically. Stephen organized his forces into a two-tier system. The first was the Ostia Mica, the small army. This was the professional corps, always ready for war. It included heavy cavalry, nobles and boyars forming the shock troops, supported by light cavalry units fast enough to scout, raid, and harass enemy columns. Alongside them marched disciplined infantry, trained, paid, and commanded, not improvised militias, but real soldiers. Command titles echoed Byzantine tradition, the spatter leading cavalry, the aga commanding infantry. The second tier was the Ostia Mare, the Great Army. This was the nation in arms. In times of invasion, every man capable of wielding a bow, spear, or axe could be summoned. Estimates placed their numbers in the tens of thousands. But more important than numbers was motivation. These men were fighting for their homes, their families, their churches. That kind of resolve can't be purchased. Stephen also embraced emerging military technology. Moldavia's artillery was remarkably modern for the mid-15th century, rivaling many Western European states. At Vaslui, Stephen deployed around 20 cannons, a significant field artillery presence for a small principality in 1475. By the time the Ottoman Empire finally moved to crush Moldavia once and for all, Stephen had already prepared the answer. He had built a force that was fast, flexible, fiercely motivated, an army capable of striking an enemy 10 times its size, and disappearing before that enemy could even understand what had hit it. It was the heart of winter in Eastern Europe, January 1475, and the Ottoman Empire made a decision that, on paper, looked bold, almost reckless. This, they believed, was the moment to launch one of their largest military operations in the region. The plan was simple in theory. First, destroy Stephen the Great and neutralize Moldavia. Second, settle into Moldavian territory for the winter, regroup, and when spring arrived, strike Hungary, linking up with the Sultan's main forces for a decisive push into Central Europe. To carry this out, the Sultan entrusted the task to one of his most powerful commanders, Hatem Suleiman Pasha, the governor of Rumelia. His orders were clear: march straight into Moldavia, even if it meant doing so at the worst possible time of the year. That alone should raise eyebrows. Winter warfare in the 15th century was brutal. When the ground froze solid and rivers turned into sheets of ice, everything became harder: food supplies, horse care, transport, even keeping gunpowder dry. Armies didn't just fight the enemy, they fought the cold itself. But pressure came from the very top. The Sultan wanted results. And so, Suleiman Pasha marched. This is where historians begin to argue, and with good reason. The numbers are staggering. Polish chronicles claim the Ottomans entered Moldavia with anywhere between 60,000 and 120,000 men. Some sources push the figure as high as 137,000, a number that borders on unbelievable when you consider winter logistics. Feeding even 100,000 soldiers in January would require a supply system of enormous scale, wagons upon wagons, just to keep frozen bread moving. On the opposite end of the spectrum, historian Carmen Gabor estimates the Ottoman force at closer to 30,000. So which version makes sense? Most modern historians focus on one crucial detail: Ottoman losses. Venetian and Polish sources speak of roughly 40,000 dead or wounded after the battle. And that fact alone tells us something important. Armies don't lose tens of thousands of men unless they started out large. This was no small, punitive expedition. When broken down, the Ottoman force becomes easier to understand. At its core stood the Janissaries, elite infantry trained for discipline and shock combat. Supporting them were the Sipahi, forming the backbone of heavy cavalry, while the fast-moving Akinci filled the role of light cavalry. Altogether, the Ottomans fielded around 30,000 cavalrymen, a terrifying force under normal conditions. But the army was already suffering long before it ever reached Moldavia. The campaign had begun months earlier. The Ottoman host assembled in Sofia in September 1474, then marched north for nearly a month through unforgiving terrain. They crossed the Danube on ice, forcing wagons, horses, and artillery across a frozen river. Day after day, soldiers trudged through sleet and frozen mud, with little rest, driven forward by a deadline they couldn't miss. Suleiman Pasha had one chance: defeat Stephen before winter fully locked the region down, or face the Sultan's wrath. By the time the Ottomans reached Moldavian lands, they were no longer fresh. They were tired, underfed, and undersupplied. And they weren't marching alone. Along the way, they absorbed a Wallachian vassal force of around 17,000 men, led by Basarab Lyota. While this boosted numbers on paper, it also multiplied logistical problems: more mouths to feed, more horses to shelter, more firewood to find. And Wallachian loyalty during this period was, at best, uncertain. These were not enthusiastic allies. Then came a group often overlooked entirely: nearly 20,000 Bulgarian peasants and support workers. They cleared roads, built bridges, and hauled supplies, essential roles for moving a massive army through winter terrain. But they also made the marching column longer, slower, and far more vulnerable. Picture a line stretching for miles, half of it unarmed. One well-placed ambush could send panic rippling through the entire formation. And ambush warfare was Stephen the Great's specialty. Stephen had assembled roughly 40,000 Moldavian troops, a remarkable achievement for such a small principality. Among them were around 5,000 Sikelis, between 2,000 and 5,000 Vlachs, approximately 2,000 Polish auxiliaries, and nearly 1,800 Hungarian soldiers. These forces didn't match Ottoman numbers, but they brought experience, mobility, and tactical flexibility. Before a single battle was fought, Stephen was already attacking the Ottoman army in ways it wasn't prepared for. Wells were poisoned, food stores burned, supply depots destroyed. Stephen understood that a winter army was already cold, hungry, and exhausted. If he could make every mile more painful, the Ottomans would arrive already weakened, half defeated before swords ever crossed. Now look at the geography. Moldavia's land naturally folds into valleys and lowlands. Stephen chose one in particular, Podolonalt, the high bridge just outside Vaslui. It was a long, narrow valley, bordered by marshland softened by melting snow. The Barlad River cut straight through it. Mud clung to everything. For a massive army, this terrain was a nightmare. Why? Because Ottoman strength lay in cavalry, and cavalry needs space. Horses must maneuver, charge, and regroup. On open ground, Ottoman cavalry could sweep outward like blades closing in from both sides. But here, there was no room. The valley acted like a funnel, squeezing the Ottoman army into a narrow column, forcing it forward in depth rather than width. One historian famously compared it to trying to push an elephant through a keyhole. And Stephen the Great had chosen that keyhole carefully. He didn't just block the path. He turned it into a kill zone. January 10th, 1475. The morning of the battle broke beneath a blanket of thick winter fog. Not a light mist, but the kind that swallows distance, where you can barely see 10 steps ahead. Anyone who has ever driven through heavy fog knows how unsettling it feels. Now imagine standing in it as a soldier, deep in unfamiliar territory, surrounded by tens of thousands of men you can't even see. The Ottoman ranks stretched thin inside the valley. Officers struggled to maintain order. They had no clear idea where the Moldavian forces were positioned or how many awaited them. Stephen's troops, meanwhile, held the high ground. Silent, concealed, some hidden behind ridges, others tucked into forest lines, artillery massed along the slopes, infantry waiting behind hastily built defenses. The fog hid everything. For the Moldavians, it was protection. For the Ottomans, it was a curse. Once enough Ottoman infantry pressed forward into the valley, the trap snapped shut. Stephen's 20 concealed cannons erupted from the hillsides. Imagine hearing artillery fire without seeing its source, thunder rolling out of the fog itself. Cannonballs tore into tightly packed Ottoman columns that had nowhere to scatter. In that confined valley, each shot became devastating, smashing through ranks like bowling balls hurled into a crowd. The Janissaries, normally the unshakable core of Ottoman discipline, were suddenly dying without understanding where death was coming from. Then came the storm. Arrows and arquebus fire poured in from 3 directions at once, straight ahead, from the left ridge, and from the right. A crossfire so dense that some chronicles claim the sky itself seemed to darken. The Ottomans couldn't form proper defensive formations. The valley was simply too narrow. As the Ottoman line began to bend, Stephen struck. His elite heavy cavalry, the Vitegi and Curtini, surged forward, followed by the Calarasi, fast-moving light horse perfectly suited for pursuit. They slammed into Ottoman flanks and rear in a coordinated assault that shattered what remained of the formation. In that moment, the Ottoman army didn't retreat, it collapsed. What followed was chaos on a scale few armies could survive. Fog, mud, screams, cannon fire. The battlefield dissolved into confusion. Thousands of Ottoman soldiers were trapped, unable to regroup, unable to flee, many unable even understand where the next blow would come from. And once a medieval army breaks, once cohesion snaps and fear takes over, the battle is already over. Stephen turned the valley into a killing ground. Ottoman losses, depending on the source, reached as high as 40,000 dead or wounded. Many soldiers drowned in the river during the panicked retreat. Others were cut down as Moldavian cavalry chased them relentlessly north. When you place those figures beside Moldavia's estimated 5,000 losses, the scale of the disaster becomes unmistakable. This was one of the worst defeats the Ottoman Empire suffered in the entire 15th century. The command structure was devastated. For pashas, veteran commanders with years of experience were killed. Hundreds of Ottoman military standards, banners symbolizing elite units, were captured. Losing men is painful. Losing leaders and symbols is catastrophic. It's the moment an army's spine snaps in real time. Even the Janissaries broke. These were not ordinary soldiers. They were the professional, disciplined heart of the empire. Yet at Vaslui, trapped in fog and mud, hammered by artillery and attack from multiple directions, even they collapsed in a panic. Observers were reminded of another humiliation, the failed Ottoman siege of Belgrade in 1456. Whenever the Janissaries faltered, it forced uncomfortable questions throughout the empire about whether Ottoman military dominance was beginning to crack. Stephen did nothing to soften the blow afterward. According to Polish chronicler Jan de Lugas, all Turkish prisoners, except those of the highest rank, were impaled and their bodies burned. This was not cruelty for cruelty's sake. It was calculated terror, a message aimed directly at Ottoman vassals like Wallachia. This is the cost of siding with the Sultan. Fear became a political weapon. But none of this compared to the reaction at the very top. Sultan Mehmed II, the conqueror himself, was stunned. Even his stepmother, Mara Brankovic, reportedly said the Ottomans had never suffered a greater defeat. Coming from within the imperial household, the words carried enormous weight. The loss shattered Mehmed's broader strategy. Plans for a deep push into Central Europe, especially toward Hungary, were abruptly shelved. Vaslui forced him to stop thinking about expansion and start thinking about revenge. Because if he didn't respond, his prestige would bleed across the empire. 2 years later, in 1476, Mehmed marched personally with an even larger army. He defeated Stephen at Valia Alba. But here's the twist. Even with that victory, he couldn't finish the job. Key Moldavian fortresses like Suceava and Niend held firm. Disease spread. Supplies ran short. Eventually, the Sultan was forced to withdraw. That is the hidden power of Vaslui. It drained Ottoman strength so deeply that even later victories couldn't secure Moldavia's conquest. It was like landing a blow so hard that every follow-up strike came weaker, slower, and ultimately failed. Then came one of the strangest political aftershocks of all. After the battle, Stephen captured 127 boys, many of them Genoese, likely taken from Italian colonies under Ottoman influence. Instead of freeing them out of Christian solidarity, he kept them as hostages, bargaining chips to pressure Venice and Pope Sixtus IV into sending financial support. It wasn't noble. It wasn't meant to be. It was cold, strategic, and effective. Stephen sent letters across Europe, reminding rulers that Moldavia wasn't just a remote land tucked between forests and rivers. In his words, it was the gateway of Christendom, and at that gateway, he had just stopped a massive Ottoman army cold. In the 15th century, news traveled slowly. Reputation traveled fast. And Vaslui gave Stephen a prestige no Moldavian ruler had ever possessed. The most powerful response came from Rome itself. Pope Sixtus IV, head of Catholic Christendom, openly praised Stephen, remarkable because Stephen was Orthodox, not Catholic. In March 1476, the Pope called him Virus Christiani Fidei Athleta, a true champion of the Christian faith. This praise wasn't symbolic. The Pope ordered that funds raised through indulgences in major Catholic cities like Baia and Citadia Alba be sent directly to Stephen. For a ruler fighting a vastly superior enemy, that support kept armies fed and fortresses standing. For a brief moment, Vaslui did something extraordinary. It blurred a centuries-old religious divide. Simply because Stephen had halted the empire everyone feared. The shock waves spread further. Venice, which learned of the conflict only days before the battle, suddenly gained leverage in negotiations with the Sultan once news arrived that an Ottoman army, possibly over 80,000 strong, had been destroyed. Even Hungary and Poland reassessed their stance. Before Vaslui, their aid had been modest. Afterward, they recognized Moldavia's strategic importance. Later that same year, Stephen and Hungary launched a joint campaign into Wallachia and succeeded. Perhaps the most underrated impact of Vaslui was the shadow it cast over Stephen's legacy. Yes, he later lost key ports like Chilia and Ackerman. Yes, he suffered defeats, but the prestige earned at Vaslui, destroying an enemy army while losing only about 5,000 men, became a kind of political armor. Western Europe continued supporting him just enough to keep Moldavia alive. Instead of becoming another Ottoman province, Moldavia remained defiant, battered, pressured, but never fully subdued. And a large part of that was because Europe never forgot what happened. On that fog-choked January morning in 1475,